Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Going forward, is China likely to become more provocative? And if the answer is yes, what does that mean for India? And thirdly, what are the implications of the Ukraine crisis for India-China relations? Those are three issues I shall raise today with an internationally renowned expert on China. He's also the former Prime Minister of Australia and the present Global President of the Asia Society and the author of a recently published book. There it is. It's there beside him. It's called The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China, Kevin Rudd. Mr. Rudd, in a recent article you wrote a couple of days ago for the Hindustan Times, you said a much more provocative Beijing is likely to be the new normal going forward. Can you start by explaining what brings you to that conclusion?
Two things, really. The first is that the balance of power is changing between China and the United States, whether it's military or economic or technological. And we see that increasingly in East Asia and the West Pacific, but increasingly also in the wider Indo-Pacific and globally. The second reason, building on the first, is Xi Jinping is a different leader from his predecessors. He is by instinct and predisposition a more assertive political leader. He wants to change the status quo. He wants to change circumstances on the ground, not just in relation to India, but in relation to all those countries and all those areas where China is seeking to establish its own preeminence. And if you anchor that back into China's regional and global vision, it is to become the preeminent power in the region and in the world by 2049.
Now, it's widely believed that when the 20th Party Congress is held later this year, Xi Jinping will get a third term as president. Will that lead to a hardening of China's assertiveness, or because he's achieved his ambition, might there be a significant change?
Well, the first assumption is correct, namely that he will be reappointed. I'd be deeply surprised if he was not. In fact, it's my anticipation that Xi Jinping will remain China's paramount leader for another 3 terms, through until 2037. And that is the way in which things are being prepared if you look carefully at the Chinese domestic ideological and political literature which is emerging. So the second part of the question is, therefore, what does he do differently in the future? I think China progressively becomes more assertive over time in higher levels of confidence about its underpinning national power, but also its ability to secure its position as well. I don't see Chinese behavior as changing like that. I see it as more a continuation of this. But therefore, we do face serious and fundamental strategic challenges and how the rest of us respond.
But a more assertive China would be a particular concern for the audience listening to you today. The question that will arise in their mind is, what does this mean for India? And in that article that you wrote for the Hindustan Times, you said India should expect continued assertiveness from Beijing. But what would that amount to?
Well, if you look at India's immediate national interests in relation to China, they're probably threefold. One, of course, is the immediate one on the Sino-Indian border, which has much complexity attached to each part of the border, whether we're talking about Ladakh, or whether we're talking about Arankal, or whether we're talking about other parts of the border. Then there's the intrinsic significance of the Chinese relationship with Pakistan. And then thirdly, there is China's widening maritime presence across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, a new and unfolding port access in Pakistan itself, the new long-term Chinese naval base in Djibouti in the Red Sea, together with unfolding string of pearls type port facilities across the wider Indian Ocean region. So these are the three zones in which we're going to see manifestation of this increased Chinese assertiveness. In terms of what that means for Indian national interests, of course, it's a matter for the government in Delhi as to how they respond. But I think it's one of the reasons why India has sought to embrace a wider set of geopolitical arrangements, including the emergence of the Quad with Japan, Australia, and the United States.
But you see China being more assertive on all three of those three zones.
I don't see any evidence in the literature that I read, which is largely China's internal discourse about where it seeks to go longer term. I do not see China retreating in any one of those three areas. In Pakistan, remember, from China's perspective, this represents the all-weather alliance. And it goes back a very long time now. And China has very few such strategic partnerships in the world. So China does not readily walk away from those arrangements. In fact, it tends to entrench them over time. Hence the huge investment we see in Pakistan through the Belt and Road Initiative in the economic corridor. On the border, China's view is incrementally change the position on the ground to China's advantage. I don't see that changing either if you put together the patterns of Chinese strategic activity over time and the reinforcement of China's positions along the border by new infrastructure investments in airport facilities, in road infrastructure arrangements, etc. And in the maritime zone, China's new naval doctrine, which is a blue water navy, what China describes as its far seas engagement, that too is part of long-standing and unfolding Chinese naval doctrine. So all of these things will continue to advance, together in the Navy's sense, with China's expanding naval capacity to give effect to that doctrine.
Let's focus a little on the Indo-China border problem, and in particular perhaps the Ladakh aspect of it, which flared up just about 2 years ago. You write in that article, it appears unlikely that Beijing will offer any concessions on the border question. So what you're saying is that the tense, fraught situation on the border will continue the way it is for the foreseeable future, with something like 60,000 troops on either side facing off on the icy heights of the Himalayas, and with adverse repercussions right across the relationship elsewhere as well. That is going to continue.
That would be my anticipation, because I see no evidence to the contrary emerging in China's strategic or foreign policy behavior elsewhere. I think the second reason is this. If you look underneath the complexity of China's security policy moves at any given time, the underlying logic is always this: to change circumstances on the ground and construct new realities. Look, for example, at China's new pattern of behavior over Taiwan. What you see is not just a one-off set of Chinese live missile tests in and around the island of Taiwan, but in fact a new normal around China's predisposition to ignore what was previously the median line across the Taiwan Strait. So for those sorts of reasons, I see nothing fundamentally changing. And I think Foreign Minister Jaishankar's response, which is there can be no normalization in the China-India relationship until the border is normalized, as an expression of complete strategic reality.
But in that answer is also, I suppose, the belief that the three areas where China has not withdrawn, Hot Springs, Demchuk and Depsang, are three areas where perhaps it's not likely to withdraw either. Those are realities India is going to have to accept.
Well, I'm the first to admit that when it comes to the detail of the sub-elements of the Sino-Indian border. I am not the world's best expert. I am a specialist in Chinese domestic politics and Chinese strategy, the Taiwan question. This is where I've focused all my life.
But isn't this the logical conclusion of what you're saying? Incremental pushing forward of the Chinese position?
Without commenting on the specifics of each of those sub-theatres, my observation would be Chinese general strategy is to advance by incremental steps and to create new realities on the ground, either through direct military action or grey zone activity, which is less obvious, and through to a series of nuanced diplomatic moves to reinforce the above.
But you also say something else in that Hindustan Times article. You say Beijing is now planning to invest more than $30 billion into developing infrastructure in Tibet, including the G695 highway, which will be built close to the line of actual control. Does this amount to a significant enhancement of China's capacity to maintain troops literally on the border facing India?
Well, one doesn't need to be an expert in military logistics to know that you need two things to support troops who are deployed. One is road and the other is by air. China is investing in both of those domains in order to make its position more sustainable over time. And what I see with patterns of Chinese behavior is that that is done in order to enhance a range of different strategic policy actions in the future, which are calibrated carefully, politically and diplomatically against the circumstances of the time. But if you look at the PLA's strategy, regionally and globally, it is a series of quite considered steps to build up a logistical and basing possibility and ability to then advance the position on the ground. The base in Djibouti, if you like, in a naval sense, its access to the port in Sri Lanka, its blue water naval capabilities, similarly in terms of land theatres, such as India faces in Tibet.
And I suppose the G695 highway fits into this completely.
Looking at it as an outsider, that would be my conclusion. Of course, there'll be other civilian applications to the rollout of this sort of highway infrastructure, as China has sought to invest on multiple fronts in the physical infrastructure of Tibet, as they've done in Xinjiang and elsewhere, because economic development from China's perspective is never incompatible with also providing the logistics for rapid PLA deployments.
Now, a little while earlier you mentioned, it was one of the 3 points you made, China's strategic relationship with Pakistan, which goes back right to, I think, 1964. Is there a sense in which strategically India could face a two-enemy front, a double jeopardy situation with China in the north and Pakistan on the west, and with a certain degree of collaboration between them?
It's difficult to hypothesize about that. It will depend on the nature of the government in Islamabad on a particular day in terms of the capacity of Pakistan or willingness of Pakistan to fully or partially comply with a broader Chinese strategy. It would be wise, I think, on the part of Indian military planners to always plan for the worst and hope for the best. But military planners are by instinct a cautious breed. And so therefore that would be a wise set of strategic contingency planning on the part of the Indian military forces. Of course, Pakistan also exhibits its own dynamic, and that is Pakistan's interests in Kashmir are not purely China's interests in Kashmir, they are partially so. They're also indigenously Pakistani. And so therefore it's a bit of a two-way street. How much would China wish to support indigenous efforts by Pakistan to advance its own interests in Kashmir and beyond, as well as the reverse? That is how Pakistan could augment Chinese actions elsewhere on the Sino-Indian border.
In these circumstances, how much leverage does India get from being a member of Quad? I know that the Chinese don't like it. They rant and rail about it pretty frequently. But the question is, how much difference does Quad membership make to India's capacity to handle both the border situation with China, but also the wider relationship?
When you step back from the immediacy of one contingency or another along the Sino-Indian border, or with Pakistan for that matter, or the Indian Ocean for that matter, you ask yourself the broader question, is China becoming more powerful? Is China rising? are its ambitions to become the preeminent regional power and ultimately the preeminent global power, which is what the 2049 objectives for China effectively say, then the rest of the world has two sets of options. One is to bandwagon with China and saying, game over, so long Uncle Sam, goodbye and good night. That's one option. That's called bandwagoning in the strategic literature. The other form of action in the strategic literature is called strategic balancing or rebalancing. And that, if you like, is what the Quad is all about. Different national governments will describe it in different terms, but in terms of underlying strategic reality, it's an effort on the part of all governments to re-establish a strategic balance with China. And the reason why governments do that is that in the act of rebalancing, it therefore affords national governments greater, shall we say, freedom of policy maneuver in our collective or individual responses to what China is doing.
But the Quad is not a military alliance. It actually makes it pretty clear that it's not. In the event of border skirmishes, perhaps even a border war between India and China, particularly on the Ladakhi Islands, what is the likelihood of America, Japan or Australia actually coming to any meaningful assistance to India? They'll certainly talk a lot about it. There'll be rhetorical support. But what about military support? Or is that not part of the Quad?
Well, right now, whether it's Tokyo, Delhi, Canberra or Washington, they won't use this language, and you've correctly said that. But you see, I think one of the diplomatic art forms associated with the evolution of the Quad is that it is elastic. It has begun as a theoretical concept. It has been through Quad 1.0. We're now into Quad 2.0. It is a level of political symmetry at one level. At a different level, it's a level of foreign policy coordination. At a different level, it is now a vehicle through greater economic and technological collaboration. Look at India's recent support, for example, for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And then associated with it, we have an increasing level of, shall we say, military exercising. And I use the term associated with it, Malabar. So the diplomatic art form is that what's being crafted here is a malleable strategic entity. And the reason I emphasize that is it can therefore further evolve.
Absolutely. That's what you're saying, that if the need arises, there is the possibility.
That's true, and that of itself affords both Delhi and Tokyo and Canberra, shall we say, flexibilities for the future.
In other words, the Quad is more than it simply seems to be at the moment. It has that possibility to evolve and take on a military dimension.
Yeah, it can be calibrated up or down, or shall I put it in these terms, to one side or the other. It's capable of both vertical and horizontal development.
Which is why the Chinese particularly dislike it, because they have sensed what you're saying.
Exactly. The Chinese are past masters at strategic realism. If you read the 7 military classics in Chinese classical literature, which date from about 1500 to 2000, 2,500 years ago, you'll see a lot in the literature about balance and rebalance. These are deeply realist traditions in China. So they understand precisely what this is about.
In fact, the Chinese have often referred to Quad as a sort of Indo-Pacific NATO.
Yeah, that is an extensive and expansive overstatement of what the reality is. NATO, at the end of the day, under its Article 5 arrangements, is a mutual defence pact.
That is missing.
And
but the possibility of military assistance in the event that it's needed, which you hinted at, is something the Chinese have sensed. And that gives Quad that additional dimension in the future when it evolves.
It provides Quad with a potentiality. And the individual political leaderships of the Quad states are deeply realistic, pragmatic, but also, I think, so far, displaying an imaginative quality, which I think perhaps causes our friends in Beijing to be a little concerned.
There's also some talk, and I'm including in that MPs of the ruling party, that India should confer on the Dalai Lama its highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna. And my question is this: do you think India has a Tibet card to play against China?
And should it do so, or would it be recklessly escalating the situation?
Well, I'm a visiting Australian, and as we say in Australia, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And that's about me as a visiting Australian suggesting to the government of India what it should do.
But you're also an analyst who understands China and can evaluate what will be the Chinese response if India were to, say, confer its highest honor on the Dalai Lama. And would it be wise given the tense situation at the moment?
I think you could safely assume that the Chinese response would not be entirely positive. And then it's a question of, frankly, deep foreign policy and strategic policy calculus by Delhi as to whether that advances or impedes India's overall strategic interests in dealing with an assertive China along the overall Sino-Indian border. So I would not be in a position to provide counsel one way or the other than to say this, that from Beijing's perspective, given the extraordinary priority it attaches to its definition of national unity, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong, things I detail in this book sitting beside me on the table here, is that on these questions there is a certain axiomatic strategic logic in Beijing's response, which is hardline. We see it in Xinjiang, you've seen it historically in Tibet, and you would, I think, on the balance of probability, see it again in Tibet if China concluded that its deep interests in sustaining and consolidating its concept of national unity in relation to Tibet was being challenged.
So in layman's language, if China feels that its position in Tibet or its sovereignty in Tibet is threatened, it will hit back hard.
It would, as I said, be less than favourable in its response, and then I will leave it to the imagination of your viewers in terms of what form that could take.
Let's broaden our discussion at this point. Something that's complicated India's-China relationship is Russia's post-Ukraine dependence on China, where it's very much the junior partner. Now, as you know, Russia is a major arms supplier to India, and practically all of that weaponry is either targeted at China or as China's close ally Pakistan. Russia has also been supportive of India on the Kashmir issue, and so far it's been neutral on the India-China border dispute. But do you see that changing now that Russia is so dependent on China?
From the Chinese perspective, the great advantage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been to finally confirm the fact that Russia is now the junior partner. Historically, this hasn't been the case. It now is. Going back to imperial times and the Tsarist period, from Peter the Great through to Joseph Stalin, through to the Sino-Soviet split at the time of Khrushchev, and through until recent decades, the Soviet Union and then more recently the Russian Federation has either been by far and above the dominant partner or a co-equal partner. That reality has now changed. From Xi Jinping's perspective, that actually is seen as a positive development. I think the other thing to bear in mind, though, as Xi Jinping looks at the diplomatic ramifications emerging from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Beijing has been surprised by the degree of European solidarity around Ukraine and deeply concerned by the fact that Germany has hardened in the geopolitics of the response, as has much of Europe in the military resupply of Ukraine. And that challenges some strategic assumptions in Beijing about Europe simply being strategically soft.
But do you see China putting pressure on Russia, A, to decrease the amount of weapons it sells to India because those weapons are targeted at China? Do you see China putting pressure on Russia to alter its India-supportive position on Kashmir because it affects its closest ally, Pakistan? Do you see China saying to Russia, we can't take neutrality on the India-China border dispute. If we are going to support you on Ukraine, you must support us on this. Do you see those changes happening?
I don't see them happening immediately, but there is a trend line in terms of greater and greater confluence between Russian and Chinese strategic policy. You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar to work out how this has evolved over the last decade. I'm a student of the Russia-China relationship to some extent. I happened to be in Beijing at the time of Gorbachev's visit in '89, when the Sino-Soviet border was finally resolved. And what has happened 30 years later is very much an outflow of what occurred at that fundamental level of territorial resolution. But right now there are bigger fish to fry in the overall Russia-China relationship. One is effective economic support for the Russian state through a maximization of Chinese oil and gas imports. Secondly, continued de facto diplomatic support for Russia's position over Ukraine in the world. And thirdly, a greater and emerging sense of economic partnership between the two countries, particularly in terms of long-term food supplies as well. I think they're the preeminent elements of the Russia-China relationship for the future, rather than the intricacies of the strategic triangle between Moscow, Beijing, and Delhi, or make it a quadrilateral if you included Islamabad in that.
But it's something that could happen as the relationship evolves.
I see a trend line, which is historical reservations, one side toward the other, about elements of foreign policy behavior increasingly being reduced. For example, you've seen a very forward-leaning Russian position in support of China's explicit interests over the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. Historically, Russia was more nuanced in what it said about such things. And so what I see elsewhere is a pattern of foreign and security policy convergence. How that affects the subcontinent, I'm not sure.
As of now, Russia and China say they have a relationship without limits. How do you see that progressing in the foreseeable future? Will Russia's dependence on China cement the relationship, or might that actually paradoxically be the irritant that introduces problems?
I think for the foreseeable future, when you have Vladimir Putin intending to remain as Russian leader until 2036, God willing, and Xi Jinping, China's paramount leader until 2037, at the 23rd Party Congress, Marx willing, then with a combination of God and Marx, we're going to look at these two leaders dominating the geopolitics of Eurasia for the next 15 years. And for those reasons, I see the nature of their personal political relationship, their distaste for the United States globally, their fear for color revolutions within their respective countries, the complementarity of their two economies, is that this will increasingly become a strategic condominium. It's almost, I think, prospectively going to be a return to the halcyon days of Sino-Soviet collaboration 49-59. But does it actually lead to a force of political reaction emerging within Russia itself? I'm not sufficient of an expert in Russian domestic politics to predict that particular dialectic, which is what happens within Russian politics. I do know, however, from my time in Moscow and dealing with members of the Russian Duma, that there is not often a natural affection for China. In fact, there's often something of a racist reaction against China.
And it's a very proud country that doesn't like to be subordinate to any other.
Very much so. And so this in time may produce, to use a Chinese term, a dialectical reaction within Russian politics itself. But it's very difficult to predict who would emerge in such a Russian political force to represent a different long-term view to China than we see in Putin himself.
Let me then ask you this. Prior to the Ukraine crisis, China was perceived as the great threat and challenge, and the West and America in particular were increasingly focused on how they respond to this. Now, has Russia become a bigger problem? And is there any possibility of rethinking about China as a result?
My think tank is based in the United States, and I've lived and worked there for most of the time since I've left political office in Australia. So I wouldn't have said this 6 or 7 years ago that I know America well, but I now think I do know America well. I spent a lot of time in Washington, Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate, current administration, previous administration, those who want to be the next administration. What I sense in the United States, particularly since 2017, is the emergence of a strong bipartisan consensus for a long-term strategy by the United States to preserve its preeminent status regionally and globally against China. That's the reality. I don't see that changing. At the same time, Russia has emerged, obviously, as a NATO-based threat to the Ukrainian state. What I sense in the United States is that their preeminent and continuing large-scale preoccupation is China, and that simultaneously they can handle the challenges presented by Russia and Europe, and with an unprecedented level of NATO unanimity in Europe as well.
I'll tell you why I asked that question. Just after the Ukraine crisis happened, one of India's most distinguished former Foreign Secretary, Shyam Saran, who is also an authority on China, wrote the following in a newspaper article. The nightmare scenario for India would be if the US comes to the conclusion that it confronts a greater threat from Russia and that this justifies a strategic accommodation with China. In blunt terms, he adds, concede Chinese dominance in Asia while safeguarding its European flank. How likely is it from your understanding of America and the people you've met that this nightmare scenario could come to pass?
Well, I know Shyam very well, and I'm a deep respecter of his contribution to Indian foreign policy, and frankly his most recent book on Chinese perceptions of India, which I think is an outstanding contribution in the field. I've certainly learned a lot from it. But in terms of Shyam's nightmare, I would say it's okay, Shyam, you can take out a glass of scotch and sleep easily at night, because I do not see any prospect of that happening in Washington within known political realities. The center of gravity of the Republican Party, even the remaining parts of the Trump Republican Party, and certainly the center of gravity of the Democratic Party, have locked on in terms of the China challenge. Australia has been an ally of the United States for the better part of 100 years. We've got to know the Americans quite well. I've been the Prime Minister of an American ally, a Foreign Minister of an American ally, and I've been through some of the crazier periods of American foreign policy, particularly in relation to Iraq, for example. But the American political system is a strange beast to observe. It's like radar. You see this tracking radar kind of doing this and doing that, until eventually the American radar locks on. They've locked on to China in the last 5 years. And the interesting thing is to see the elements of the American political and military and economic establishment and technological establishment then beginning to direct their efforts collectively at a principal strategic objective. It takes a long time to get there, but once they lock on, my experience is they tend to really lock on.
Let me for a moment exploit your understanding of America, because we're coming to the end of this interview. Is the West, and I suppose I mean America in particular, reconciled to India's pretty strong reservation and refusal to criticize the invasion of Ukraine, plus the pretty sharp increase in the purchase of Russian oil? Today, according to the April-June quarter that just ended, 12.9% of India's oil imports came from Russia. It used to be under 1% a year ago.
My observation in the United States, and I often attend conferences in America with people in and around the US administration, is that there is a high degree of relaxation, a high degree of calm about India's historical relationship with the Russian Federation. They understand the nature of Indian military kit and equipment, when it was purchased, how it's serviced. They also understand the nature of the hydrocarbon relationship. So therefore, I do not sense any fundamental reservations in Washington about the current pattern of India's response to Ukraine. You see, it will take a long time for the pattern and composition of Indian military purchases worldwide to change. And as America relaxes historical restrictions on the purchase of American kit and equipment from the United States by India, these things will change over time. I think the mark of the emerging maturity of the India-US relationship is that there are degrees of mutual accommodation about these questions.
Except the Ukrainian foreign minister went out of his way to point out a couple of days ago that if India is getting Russian oil cheaply, it's at the cost of Ukrainian blood. That got picked up in a big way in India. I imagine it must have been heard in America as well. It was a very emotional thing to say at a time when the Americans are putting in billions of dollars into Ukraine's military equipment. Does it not worry them that India is increasing its purchase of Russian oil?
Well, at present, if you look carefully at the nature of the sanctions regime against Russia, imposed by the United States and its allies, it does not prescribe the cessation of oil imports today or tomorrow. And so let's be very clear about the underpinning arrangements here. These will change over time, particularly given European signalling about the future. And if you're the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, you would expect the Foreign Minister of Ukraine to say such things, as I'm sure the Ukrainians are saying to others around the world, including Europe.
Can I interrupt? The relationship between India and America, and this is true of the relationship between India and the rest of Quad, is not really a strategic relationship. They keep saying in their rhetoric, it's a relationship of shared values. Now, if your values are what unite you, but India refuses to criticize the invasion of a sovereign country and instead increases pretty sharply its purchase of oil from the invading country, then it looks as if that relationship of values is coming under questions.
Well, diplomacy, in my experience, is an imperfect business, and therefore there is neither black nor white. It's usually one form or another of a shade of grey. But this shade of grey is becoming more defined over time. India's democratic voice in the world is important. India's national interests are important.
And its market.
And India's future economic development is important as well. And all these three elements will come together in terms of India's long-term relationship with the United States and what I would say is the rest of the democratic world. I personally dislike intensely the term the West. Often our friends in Europe and the United States forget the impact of long-term, shall we say, European colonial presence right across Asia. I'd much prefer look to a more meaningful and substantive unifying values concept such as our common and shared democracy, rather than the origins of Western civilization, which, as you know, has a dubious historiography in India.
What about the impact of India's position on Ukraine on the Quad? It's the only one of the four countries that hasn't strenuously, strongly and publicly criticized the Russians. Secondly, Sergei Lavrov paid a very welcome visit to Delhi in March, and Prime Minister Modi will be meeting President Putin in just over 2 weeks' time at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit. Does that disturb Quad?
I don't believe so. If you were to ask the government of Japan and the government of Australia and the government of the United States, do all three of those governments lock in behind every single Indian government position on Pakistan and Kashmir? I'm not sure. Are we broadly supportive of India's strategic interests? Yes. Do we seek to work with our Indian friends and partners in foreign policy and military terms wherever possible? Yes. Do we have neatly intersecting sets on everything? Well, no. But there is a greater degree of convergence over time than there is divergence.
But you also cut each other a bit of slack.
Well, I think the business of diplomacy, as I said, is untidy. Remember what Bismarck once said about politics? He said, politics is never a business to be observed closely. It's like the making of sausages. Better to look at it from a slightly more distant perspective.
My last question, given, and this flows out of everything you've said, that the India-China relationship is likely to be troubled and tense for the foreseeable future, as an analyst, not as someone advising the Indian government, do you think India should seek to become closer to America, to the Quad, to the West, to use the phrase you don't like, or should it continue to maintain its carefully balanced relationship with Russia?
Obviously, the government of India will make its own national interest calculations about that. But there are two overriding principles which I think will be important in Delhi's consideration. One is that Russia globally is a declining power. Russia's economy is now smaller than Australia's. Let's always bear that in mind. And secondly, China is a rising power, which represents a significant challenge to all of us in the democratic world, as well as in the strategic stability of the wider Indo-Pacific region. These are the two, I think, long-term animating forces which the government of India will always be mindful of in shaping its decisions in the future. And it's these considerations which I think bring us together, these disparate countries in the Quad, with a common set of strategic interests and values, however imperfect the current intersection of sets may be.
Hidden in that answer, and I'm just drawing it out for the audience, is that if China is the rising power and your relationship with China is troubled and tense, you need friends who will be on your side. Russia is not capable of providing that critical friendship because of its own dependence on China. The Americans, Quad, the West, even though you don't like that term, are more capable. That's hidden in the answer, isn't it?
I never hide answers, so let me challenge the proposition. I'm being direct as I can. I think the reality is that given Russia's current levels of economic dependency and foreign policy dependency on China, it will increasingly fold into a level of strategic condominium with China over time. And therefore, when it comes to India's long-term security interests and foreign policy interests, that will command its own logic. For China, there is a saying in Chinese which is as follows: "Sha yi jing bai," kill one to warn 100. In other words, if you're out there swinging in the breeze by yourself and you pursue a course of action which is alien to China's interests, then they are going to apply maximum pressure on you individually. But if you're not one, but you are several or many, that becomes a little harder. It pays, as we say in Australia, to hunt in packs.
Absolutely. And it also follows from that that there is a pack that would suit India a lot better. Mr. Rad, thank you very much for a fascinating interview.
It's good to be with you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.